Hello, this is Cho of the Shiny Colors Discord. Welcome to another episode of the Shiny Review. Today we have a lot of cards to talk about. 6 technically in total, so many that I could barely fit them on here, and in fact 2 of them didn't even make it, but they'll still be included regardless. We have the Parallel Collection cards for Natsuha and Asahi, as well as the limited supports for Hazuki. We have the Paracole SSRs for Natsuha and Asahi, as well as the limited time SSRs for Hazuki and Kaho. And we also have the Date Collection Amana and Tenka. Keep in mind that all of these cards are technically limited. Once their banners are over, getting them is going to be significantly harder or outright impossible depending on which card we're talking about. At the very least with Parallel Collection for now, as long as a new Parallel Collection happens, there is a very small chance you can get them on a future banner. The rest, you're just going to have to hope that they're added somewhere else in the future. With that all being said, let's get started and talk about Natsuha. Round 6 of Paracole is a doozy, hitting us hard with a timeline in which Natsuha performs her graduation live, something that many fans of any performer are aware could happen at any time. There's a real sense of hope and positivity radiating from the card itself, and Natsuha naturally takes this decision in stride, as you should expect from her. As a card, she's an AoE vocal unit with an emphasis on attention up, and packs that in with some interest manipulation and a tiny bit of damage cut to play defense. Natsuha, from my perspective, is a card that helps tie together a lot of the aspects that make vocal Hokuda its own style of team compared to dance and visual. Her role within the team is extremely flexible, allowing her to play any particular role you need, and she's capable of doing it without too much issue. Just note that if you run her as your main attacker in the vocal position, or even as a center, you need much more attention up sources than usual. Especially if you run her as a center. She's a fantastic all-rounder style card. Her roles are center, maybe, we'll get into it. She has attack all, she has attention up, and she is a buffer. I moderately to highly recommend pulling for this Natsuha. Natsuha's initial appeal is a vocal 1.0 to 5.0 to all judges that scales based on how high your attention is. This also grants a 50% attention buff for 4 turns. The plus appeal, which requires 4 or more Hokuda in your skill history, and for it to be turn 6 or earlier, grants a vocal 100% buff for 3 turns, and lowers the judge's interest by 80% for 1 turn. The 4-star version of this appeal is a vocal 1.2 to 6.0 to all judges that scales based on how high your attention is, and grants the same 50% attention up buff for 4 turns. The plus appeal has the same requirements and the same effect as the initial. You need to have 4 Hokuda in your skill history, and for it to be before turn 6, or at least turn 6. It lowers the judge's interest by 80% for 1 turn, and grants a 100% vocal buff for 3 turns. For her passives, her 1-star passive is a vocal 60% up and attention 50% up if it's turn 2 or earlier. It has a 35% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a vocal 120% up and attention 50% up, as long as you are running the entire Hokuda lineup. This has a 30% chance to activate 3 times, and comes with a vocal plus 100 uncap. At 3 stars, she gets an additional plus 100 vocal uncap. At 4 stars, a vocal plus 150 uncap alongside her rainbow passive, rounding out to a plus 450 total to her vocal uncap. Said rainbow passive is a vocal 140% up and mental damage 50% cut, as long as you have 2 or more active attention up buffs. This has a 30% chance to activate twice and is limited to once per turn. Her memory appeal when maxed out is an attention 100% down for 3 turns that links into a vocal 7.0 that scales based on how high your attention is. She also has a charge appeal, which at level 1 is a vocal 1.0, upgrading its way all the way to a vocal 2.5 if it's at level 5 and you are currently at 4 stars. It's fascinating that we've gone back to the self-sabotaging memory appeal, something that has rarely worked out well in the past. That said, there's plenty of ways to bolster your attention to the point where the minus 100% isn't a ginormous impact, but it can still be kind of annoying to play around. A vocal 9.5 is still real beefy, but there's no shortage of options for vocal Hokuda. Now, just like with Twicolate, Paracole does not feature a Hazuki system from the get-go, meaning that any dupes you get will either be really expensive or really rare if your luck is poor. Natsuha is a card where there isn't a ton of particular emphasis on one half of her kit or the other. The passives help outweigh the drawbacks of her memory appeal, so getting 1 to 2 extra copies isn't the worst idea. Her rainbow passive is a bit of an oddity, but it is meant to pair up with the fact that you will be hit thanks to the higher attention values. Go with your gut, but as always, I would say the safest place to stop would be 2 stars, and to only push further if you really need the larger emphasis on her charge appeal, or really feel that you need that 4-star passive. For the support recommendations, I consider the MVP to be Twicolate Jury, but there are a lot of other good options that other producers have been doing. Vocal Good Stuff makes a comeback with Vocal Antika, as if it ever went anywhere, as one could probably expect. Vocal Hokura have also gotten some solid support over the last year to make the shell a bit more respectable. Cards like the recent Choco, who's a straight upgrade to Safari Choco, as well as the Kaho support from the MV collection that is actually still real solid. All of these cards play into what Natsuha wants to do a bit more than some of the other supports. Really, the deciding factor between which side you choose comes down to what you have more of, but generally speaking, if you have to pick, the Antika shell has seen a bit more success overall. It's got a bit more firepower, and some appeals end up seeing usage thanks to Interest Reverse as a means to set up for the following turns. Speaking of, New Year's Meguru is here for that exact reason, as her appeal is the vocal equivalent to Daikichi Kogane, who operates on the same principle. For some suggestions on synergy, Rinzai 9, aka Twicolate Rinzai, was the previous backbone to Vocal Hokura, now relinquishing this role to Natsuha once you find her. Her AoE appeal when maxed out is devastating, even alongside somebody like Natsuha, and her memory appeal is no slouch either when you consider the charge appeal. If you're not very confident in utilizing Natsuha's memory appeal, running Natsuha in the vocal position and Rinzai as a center is certainly very valid. The other option for a center that isn't here but is worth mentioning is My Collei Jury, another card that has a fantastic memory appeal and works well with what Hokura want to do. Choco 10, a permanent Choco, is a card I am once again on my soapbox to defend. Her ability to double stack attention up makes utilizing Natsuha's passive a breeze, and narrows down the amount of attention up you need by a decent amount. She's a fun tech option and certainly not necessary or mandatory, but I think she is a very fun card to work around with for the team in particular. Kaho 11, a limited SSR, is an interest-focused unit whose slow appeals amplify the damage judges will take on the following turn. Pairing her up with Natsuha can dish out severe damage to every judge, whether it's her AoE appeals or her memory appeal. She's a great card to synergize with the high damage that Natsuha can output by multiplying that by a lot. Now for the grades. As a center, I'm going to give Natsuha an A+ to an S. Realistically, probably close to double S if we had more consistent attention up buffs. A vocal 9.5 is naturally insane, even if the conditions are seen as annoying depending on the types of supports you choose to run. The biggest downside to the memory appeal is what we mentioned prior. It reduces your attention on use, meaning you have to overcompensate for this if you intend to use her as a center. This can be worked around, but some may not want to bother with that. We haven't had a lot of good supports with attention up in a while. Many of them are usually hovering around that 50% range, meaning that it's harder to stack up a ton of high value attention compared to smaller values that last a little bit longer. As such, having that -100 can be very frustrating. It's not as bad, for example, as some of the other cards that reduce your attention by 200%, which is real bad. So at least this one can be kind of worked around compared to the other. It's still going to be tricky, but there are ways to do it. It may not be the most optimal, which is why I don't grade her as highly as something very close to her, because otherwise a 9.5 would just be like immediate cream of the crop, but because of that downside, it gets a slightly lower grade. As a unit, S+. Natsuha is one of those units where she really does almost everything that you'd want. Her AoE appeals may not be the best thing to throw out on turn 1, which is fine, but a well-timed appeal can put some serious dents into any judge. Her passives not having any memory gauge boost is the usual downside. It feels like they really only locked that to specifically Alstroemeria because that was kind of their gimmick, and so you're going to have to compensate that memory gauge boosting with either grad-focused abilities that are hard to get, or step-related passives in order to help make things a little bit easier. That's also why cards like MV Kaho show up, because they offer at least some amount of memory gauge. Besides these downsides, she is a high-powered unit on the offensive and can definitely tackle judges in tandem with other Hokura cards. I think this card is real neat. So next then, we have Asahi. In another timeline, Asahi takes the disbanding of Straylight as an opportunity to study abroad in America for a few years. She's taller than Fuyuko now, and has even lost her iconic Su verbal tick. She's still as blunt as ever, but in a way that feels a bit more calculated. Paracole Asahi is a single-target buffer, adopting the pick from a set buff type, but for vocal up. She grabs 3 of these per appeal, enabling some passives and playing into the original goal of Stray Light. Asahi is another very self-sufficient card, enabling her passives through her appeals without too much trouble. Her memory appeal is crazy strong for a 3-member team and is insanely consistent at using it. It works stupidly well with Stray Light's game plan of stacking buffs and can play well with virtually any vocal team if they're willing to commit to it. While she's not a ludicrous AoE unit, she's still a force to be reckoned with and is certainly worth picking up if you can. Her roles are center, buffer, and she has access to mulligans. Her roles are center, buffer, and she can have mulligans, and I highly to moderately recommend pulling for this Asahi. If you are somebody that already has a very strong vocal team, there is a good reason to pick this card. Asahi's initial skill is a Vocal 4.0 appeal that fortifies your vocal buffs. It then applies 3 random buffs between a vocal 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50% buff for 5 turns. The plus appeal, which requires just 2 or more Stray Light cards in your skill history, grants you +1 mulligan. The 4-star version of this appeal is a Vocal 5.0 that fortifies your vocal buffs and applies 3 random buffs between a vocal 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70% up for 3 turns, and has the same plus appeal with the same requirements, a +1 mulligan if you have 2 or more Stray Light in your skill history. Now do keep in mind that this means that it can technically lowball you. Just like with duets and double duets, it can pick between the same buff multiple times. So you could get 3 times vocal 10%, or you could get 3 times vocal 50%, or 3 times vocal 70%, depending on which appeal you're using. Most of the time it's going to deviate to some crazy amount, but just understand that it's multiple vocal buffs, and that's really all that you care about. It's just a small bonus if they happen to be really strong. Her 1-star passive is a vocal 60% up if it's turned 2 or earlier, and it has a 35% chance to activate once. Her 2-star passive is a vocal 140% up that requires 3 or more active vocal up buffs. It has a 30% chance to activate twice. This comes with a vocal +100 uncap. At 3 stars, she gets an additional vocal +100 uncap. At 4 stars, an additional vocal +150, rounding out to +450 vocal, alongside her rainbow passive. Said rainbow passive is a vocal 160% up if you have 6 or more active vocal up buffs. This has a 30% chance to activate 3 times and is limited to once per turn. Her memory appeal when maxed out is a vocal 2.5 that fortifies your vocal buffs. That follows up with a vocal 3.0 that fortifies your vocal buffs. And the charge appeal, just like usual, is a vocal 1.0 at level 1, working its way up to a vocal 2.5 at level 5 at 4 stars. Asahi's rainbow passive is funny, in that using both of her appeals immediately puts this online. While that may not be the smartest thing to do, it sure is funny. Her memory appeal makes a turn 5 Stray Light appeal seem very funny, but there's a lot of ways to make it work. People have already found ways to abuse her memory appeal already, with or without Stray Light. Now, as for the number of copies, just like before, 2 stars is a pretty safe place to stop if you don't care about the charge appeal. Asahi is more than capable of doing what she intends to do with this in mind, as her singular appeal brings her passive online, the 2-star one, which is more than enough depending on your situation. Only commit to more copies if you want to push her into the higher grades and need the additional firepower of her memory appeal more than anything. For the support recommendations, I would say the MVP is Twaikule Mei, alongside Date Fuyuko, and then we have more vocal good stuff. Very similar to the style of supports recommended earlier, but now you can opt into Twaikule Mei and Date Collection Fuyuko, who all work within what PC Asahi want to do. Kaho is a good inclusion, but only if you run Fuyuko or Mei, otherwise the point of the card is entirely lost if you opt to run a, say, Halo team that ignores the rest of Stray Light. Otherwise, vocal good stuff is here to stay for a while, so cards like Kogane, Sakuya, and Bamimi are still good to bring along, as well as cards like Meguru for the reasons we talked about earlier in the video. For some synergy suggestions, the first is Fuyuko 8, which is the best thing going for Vocal Stray Light, being an AoE unit that applies Vocal Fortify on each of her appeals. She has a free memory gauge for having vocal up buffs, letting Asahi access charge appeals a little bit easier. Luca 3, aka My Kole Luca, is still one of the dumbest cards they've ever decided to print. Her AoE appeals apply interest reverse while also raising, aka lowering, the judge's interest for the turn, turning this into a damage amp if you manage to activate her plus appeal. Say Halo has absolutely broken this card, and a lot of people have been running her alongside Asahi because of the way that the new game mode works. As for Haruki 3, I vaguely recall a while back referring to Haruki 3 as a vague Stray Light card. Thanks to the new Produce mode, this idea has come to fruition. She's another card that can provide memory gauge just like Fuyuko for the same conditions, meaning that, again, it'll be much easier for you to access your charge appeal while utilizing Asahi, thanks to cards like Haruki and Fuyuko. For the grades, Asahi earns a very easy S+ to double S. It's a Vocal 8.0 with 0 strings attached, and only gets better when you consider that each piece of the memory appeal applies Vocal Fortify, which, if you have forgotten, doubles the effectiveness of all active vocal buffs the time you use it. So if you already have vocal buffs active, like say a 40%, then it's transformed into an 80% until the buff wears off. So that means those 70% we saw earlier get translated to 140%, and any other buffs that you have prior to using your memory appeal receive that buff as well, which then just get multiplied further by the fact that you're amplifying them again. It stands to reason that thanks to the new game mode, players have been breaking the hell out of this memory appeal by shifting the focus entirely, allowing stronger teams to set up this walking cannon for greatness. It's no secret that, at this point right now, the weakest member of Vocal Straylight is Mei, and so, players have been opting to use one of these stronger vocal teams in the game right now, Comedic, to pair up with this Asahi through Say Halo, turning her link appeals into pseudo-Comedic links, meaning that it is way easier to utilize that with much stronger characters, and in turn, is kinda dominating Gradefest in its own unique way. As a unit, I would give her an A. Her game plan is very basic, and the variance of her appeals is negligible at best. One thing I've learned about these types of appeals, which we talked about earlier, since the last time we did a deep dive, is that these buffs that it can select are not mutually exclusive. In other words, you can roll the weakest buff 3 times, just like you can roll the same character in a double duet. This doesn't hinder her game plan at all, it just means that your potential damage can come off as very inconsistent. She is a very self-sufficient card, and she is very useful regardless of that fact. She certainly feels like a much stronger version of the two, which is kind of crazy to compare to, the Natsuha specifically. But I think both of these cards are still very good. So next, as we step away from Pericole, we have Hazuki. As part of a tie-in with the conclusion to Shiny Moss's second anime season, Hazuki arrives to quickly give her her third support SSR within the last couple months. This time she's visual with an interesting set of passives designed for off-position units, actively acknowledging the playstyle players have been utilizing for quite a while. Her masteries are solid, doing exactly what you'd hope for a generic support. She's good, but not drastically game-changing, sort of in the same way as the first Hazuki, but slightly weaker overall. Her masteries include Hazuki's Bond as opposed to Idol's Bond, Promise Recovery and Rest Boost, and her unique support masteries are Visual Mastery SP reaching plus 12 at level 75, Visual Mastery Visual Limit Up reaching plus 4 at level 80, Excellent Boost reaching plus 5 at level 80, and Visual Mastery Stamina reaching plus 5 at level 80. She does have a scaling support appeal, but you can't use it, but it is a Visual 3.0 to 3.5. Her TFT idea is Talk, her Insight Token for Grad is Mental, and her proficiency and landing point is in Visual. Hazuki's initial uncaps are a Visual plus 25, Visual plus 25, and Mental plus 50. At 1 star, she unlocks her first passive, a Visual 50% up if it's turned 3 or earlier, and has a 20% chance to activate 3 times. Her 2-star passive is a Visual 120% up if you have 2 or more different units on your team, and has a 20% chance to activate twice. At 3 stars, she gets 2 separate Visual plus 50 uncaps, and at 4 stars, she gets her 1 appeal, a Visual 3.5 that fortifies visual buffs and grants a Visual 60% buff for 4 turns, also unlocking a Visual 150% up passive, which requires you to be in the vocal or dance position. It has a 30% chance to activate once, and comes with a Visual plus 100 uncap. New Hazuki is an interesting card, and I'm going to give her a B+ to an A. She feels very heavily based around the voted support cards we got a while back, aka the MV cards. I appreciate her final buff being specifically a strong effect for units that are off the main position for visual, but that's about all I can really give for the unit. The masteries are okay, but they're nothing insane, and the rest of her kit feels very normal. I have a feeling that many players will still find a way to use her, but I would say that she's the weaker compared to the Rainbow Hazuki, in kind of the same way that the Dance Hazuki I think is a little weaker than the initial. I would moderately recommend pulling for this Hazuki. Next, we now have a support for Kaho. A surprisingly weird card to throw near the end of the year, we have our first technical Parallel Collection support, featuring PC Kaho, Asahi, and Natsuha. This is a visual support with functionality that really only best works in Straylight, as Fortify is something that Hokura very rarely considers for their team. The masteries are a little all over the place, and overall the card is okay, but is really something you pick up for the novelty of it over being a genuinely strong card. It is very cute, however, so pull wisely. Her support skills include Idol's Bond, Promise Recovery, and Rest Boost. She has 5 unique support skills: Visual Mastery SP, reaching plus 15 at level 75, Tension Mastery Visual Limit Up, reaching plus 4 at level 80, Visual Stay Mastery alongside Visual Mastery Stamina, both reaching plus 5 at level 80, and Unit Mastery SP reaching plus 5 at level 75. Her support appeal does scale, starting at a Visual 3.0, working its way up to a Visual 3.5. Her TFD idea is Visual, her Insight token for Grad is Vocal, and her proficiency and landing point is in Visual. Kaho's initial appeal is a Visual 2.5 that fortifies your visual buffs and grants you a Visual 20% buff for 4 turns. Her 1-star passive is a Visual 50% up if it's turn 3 or earlier and has a 20% chance to activate 3 times. Her 2-star passive is a bit of an oddity. It's a Visual 130% up that requires Kaho, Natsuha, and Asahi on your team. It has a 30% chance to activate once. She has 2 Visual plus 50 uncaps at 3 stars, and at 4 stars, a Visual 3.5 appeal that fortifies visual buffs and grants a 60% visual buff for 4 turns. And a Visual 120% up passive that requires Kaho, Natsuha, or Asahi in your skill history. There is specific phrasing between those 2 passives. One is or, so it can be any of them, and one is and, meaning it needs to be all 3. This has a 30% chance to activate once and comes with a Visual plus 100 uncap. Kaho gets a B. Kaho is a weird revision of the MV supports we got a while ago, just with slightly updated passives. This card does nothing unless you specifically are playing a Say Halo team built around this specifically, as there isn't really a reason unless you are playing a Visual Stray Light team that utilizes a Visual Kaho and Visual Natsuha. Otherwise, you're going to have to build around this via Say Halo. She's certainly built to be a Stray Light card first and foremost, and even then isn't necessarily all that insane to consider when building. She's fine, but I would say there are still plenty of other things to work with that maybe come off as a bit better. I would moderately recommend pulling for this Kaho. Much like with any other card, I think the novelty of it is really cute, and is worth pulling for that merit, but for the functionality, it just seems a little misplaced. And finally, as we get to the end here, we have the date collections for Amana and Tenka. Notably, Tenka is the vocal card, while Amana is the dance card. They're functionally identical, but they're split between 2 different stats. Both of these cards are only here if you like these 2 characters specifically. While they aren't terrible cards, they're fairly situational, and plenty of other cards exist at a similar power level. Just note that both have passives that only activate if you have 2 of that relevant character in your skill history. So Tenka is Tenka, and Amana is Amana. For the notable masteries, just substitute Vocal for Dance, depending on which card you're talking about. They have Vocal Mastery SP, reaching plus 12 at level 75, otherwise plus 9 at 65, plus 7 at 50. Vocal Mastery Vocal Limit Up, reaching plus 4 at level 80, otherwise plus 3 at level 70, plus 2 at level 60. Excellent Boost, reaching plus 5 at level 80, or plus 3 at level 70, and Vocal Mastery Stamina, reaching plus 5 at level 80, otherwise plus 3 at level 65. For the notable passives and appeals, at 2-star, they unlock Vocal 120% up if there are 3 or more healing instances in the run, which has a 20% chance to activate twice. At 4 stars, they unlock an appeal and a passive. The appeal is a Vocal 3.5 appeal and mental 2% regen for 3 turns, alongside an instant mental 5% heal. At 4 stars, a Vocal 120% up if 2 or more Tenka are in your skill history. This has a 30% chance to activate once. The total uncap is a plus 250 to Vocal. As much as I would want to do a comprehensive list for both of these cards, they're the exact same card, and I felt it would be easier to just consolidate them. As mentioned before, they're both fine. But you can certainly pick up cards of similar strength but still have other applications compared to these 2. There is no overlap in the skill history portion of their passives. Tenka's passive requires 2 Tenka, Amana's passive requires 2 Amana. The art is cute between the 2 of them, but also remember these cards have no story attached, but the alt art if you decide to max them out. I kinda lowly to moderately recommend pulling for these cards. Like I said, I don't think they're super duper important. I would give them a B to a B+ at most, but I think it's just mostly for the novelty of getting the cards or the cute art. Functionally, I think there are certainly other things you could be doing. The masteries themselves are just kinda fine, and the passives are also just kinda fine. So, that will do it for this very long video today. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. This should also realistically be the final video of 2024, so I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been supporting the channel ever since we started this up back in 2019. It has been a heck of a ride, and while I don't really know where we'll be going in 2025, we certainly got at least a couple things coming your way here in the next coming weeks. So please look forward to that. We also have, of course, the upcoming banner for New Year's, which they've revealed to be Jury as the produce card and Madoka as the support. I'm real scared to see what these cards are going to do, because New Year's is almost always a weird game breaker. So let's look forward to that banner together. Till then, I've been Cho. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. Have a happy New Year, and I'll see you next time. Take care.